Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that we have to meet like this rather than some other more interesting live way. But anyway, let's do the best we can. Thanks for joining this lecture. I have to warn you, though, that it's not going to be very pleasant. I have a lot of bad news to give you. So I hope you're ready for a bit of a slightly depressing situation, because I'm afraid I have to tell it like it is. I have to tell you what the reality is, and the reality is not very bright at all. So let's just begin by talking about what exactly is going on and how serious is it. So I have to tell you that this is actually unprecedented. This is something the world economy has never seen and is unlikely to see again, I hope. But it is something unprecedented in the extent and possibly in the severity. So at the moment, there are many, many things we don't know. We don't know the extent of the virus spread. We don't know the severity of the virus and how many people it will actually affect across the world. We don't know how long it will go on. We actually know very, very little about this. Will it be over in a few months? Will it take a year? Will it be one round of infections, a subsidence, and then another round? We actually have very little idea right now about how bad the virus itself is going to be. But we do know one thing, which is that already the measures that are being taken to control the pandemic, they have already had such devastating impact that we have never seen the like before. Okay, this is something which is unparalleled in global capitalism. In the last, I would say, 2 centuries, we have never had this combined cessation of economic activity across most of the world. So in that sense, it is unprecedented, it's unusual, and there are no standards by which to go. There is, we can't compare this, let's say, to demonetization in India. A lot of people have done that, but it's much more severe. We can't compare this to the 2008 crisis, because that was basically a crisis coming from finance and then infecting the real economy, but not really affecting people's mobility, people's ability to travel. It didn't damage every segment of the economy. This is not even like the Great Depression, which was also something that was a combination of a real imbalance and a financial imbalance, which then spread across the world, because that too did not involve this kind of limit on physical activity and even on physical production. So we're in a whole new world. Is it then like a war? A lot of people have compared this to a war. And in some senses, yes, but again, a war is not a good comparison, because even in a war, yes, there are shortages. Yes, there are breakages of supply chains and there's problems of demand and all of those things. But again, you can still move people around. You can still get people into producing the things that you're short of. You can still take various measures, which today, because of the very fear of the disease and its spread, you cannot do. So this means that we are in uncharted waters. We've never been here before. And so predictions are very, very difficult. What we'll have to do, therefore, is instead of predicting what could happen 6 months from now, let's just look at the impact of what has already happened. And unfortunately, that itself is really quite stark and quite depressing. So what's happened? In the world economy already, I'm going to do this over 3 steps. I'm going to look at the global economy as overall, then I will look at the advanced economies very briefly, and then I will focus a lot of time on the developing economies and what's actually happened in the developing world and what will happen in the developing world. Okay, so what's happened globally? Well, of course, we know that the lockdown has meant many, many countries have actually either reduced or almost stopped a whole range of trading activity. So global trade is actually collapsing. It's nosediving. And that's because production has stopped. Imports have dramatically reduced. They're focused on specific items. Exports are almost impossible. Supply chains have broken. Remember that more than half of trade in Asia, 80% of trade in Asia, but more than half of global trade is in intermediate goods because of the massive growth of global supply chains. All of that is coming to a halt. So global trade is dramatically affected. And that's global trade in both goods and services. A lot of services still increasingly are traded online. And those, to a significant extent, have survived. In fact, you could argue that some services are now occurring which did not occur. You and I, some of us are interacting through this means which we would not have done in the past. So we are still operating in a way, and a lot of those kinds of services, ICT-enabled services, will continue. But a huge bunch of other traded services are no longer viable. And of course, a lot of them had to do also with goods trade, because merchandise trade requires insurance, it requires transport and freight, it requires a range of other services. And those were very, very large parts of total services. All of that has gone. Tourism has gone. Medical tourism has gone. Education movement. I mean, all kinds of services also have been immediately and drastically affected. FDI. Well, no surprises to say that FDI is on hold. Who would invest where at this point? Anyone who is planning even a major takeover, forget greenfield FDI, which of course everybody is going to wait and see. But even brownfield FDI, even mergers and acquisitions, people acquiring other companies in different parts of the world, all of that also increasingly just right now on hold. Okay. Financial flows in general, let's look at portfolio investments, dramatic declines of fresh flows and very large gross flows, because a lot of capital is moving, as they say, back to safety. So we'll talk about that, but there's a significant capital outflow from emerging markets and developing countries coming back to the developed world. So there are still gross capital flows, but they're not necessarily positive. They're really flying to safety and flying to havens where they think that they can survive this current mess. There's banking credit, and here too there's a massive problem. Globally, we had already reached a peak of credit to GDP ratios in many, many countries of the world. In fact, if you take both developed and developing countries as groups, we've never had such high credit to GDP ratios as we have today. And a significant part of that was actually cross-border credit. It was external commercial borrowing, or it was investment in bond markets. Okay, so non-bank kinds of investment. And that too is, of course, dramatically affected, because a large part of those who have taken on these debts are simply going to be unable to repay. You take on a debt if you're a productive enterprise, or because you assume that you are going to be able to repay it through your own operations. Operations have ceased. Everything's on hold, right? And so you cannot repay right now for what you had borrowed, even working capital for the previous months and so on. So there is a massive kind of churning going on in global banking and non-bank bond markets right now. Another one that people don't talk about so much, but it's insurance. Now, insurance companies, many of them will simply go under, because you cannot actually meet all the claims. Nobody had calculated for this kind of cessation of economic activity, because it simply never happened before. Not in my lifetime, not in the last century. This complete stoppage, even if it's, well, in India, they say it's for 3 weeks, but let us assume it'll be for longer. In some countries, it's already going on for 2 months, likely to go on for another 2 months. This has never happened before. And so insurance markets that have to pay out claims from companies who had taken, shall we say, broader kinds of policies that allowed them that kind of leeway, they are going to find they simply cannot deal with the kinds of claims. And so they would have to go under. So overall, there is this massive churning in both goods and capital markets. And then, of course, there's the movement of people. Okay, migration. What happens to migration in scenarios like this, when you're simply not allowing people to move even within countries? Obviously, cross-border movement of people has been stopped pretty much across the world. Everybody is closing their borders. Sometimes they're closing borders even within their countries, between states, as we have done in India, as is planned in the United States and in a bunch of other places. So the movement of people, which also had a very important role not as significant as goods, services, and capital, but nonetheless, it had a very important role. That too has suddenly halted. Those migrants who are unable to return home are stuck where they are, but many of them have lost their livelihoods as well. All of this, it would be bad enough if any one of them had happened by itself, where all of these are happening together. And it's not just in one region. It would be bad enough if it were happening in one region. The global financial crisis, if you remember, was basically the US and then spread to other countries and economies and other regions. This is happening everywhere. In fact, and this has never really happened before. China is just beginning to recover its production after it went through an early phase of these closures and so on. And of course, China is doing a better job of handling it because it is largely a planned economy still in many ways. I'll come back to that point. But most of the world has no experience of handling this within this generation. Policymakers are simply not equipped to kind of figure out how to deal with this. And so that combination of all of these things happening together is, as I said, unprecedented. Okay, right. Now, what about the advanced economies? To be fair, it looks like there is a recognition of the sheer scale of this problem, of the magnitude of the disaster that will await us if we don't immediately take action. Okay, so many countries have actually come out with very, very large public spending programs, anywhere between 5 to 15% of GDP. The package announced by Mr. Trump amount is supposed to be around 10% of GDP. In many European countries, as I said, between 5 to 15% of GDP, very, very large amounts. Why? Because the idea is not at this point to just kickstart. The idea is to stabilize, to prevent a free fall. The idea is to stop this complete collapse, because we know that right now, all right, you've got a lockdown in most countries, you're not doing economic activity. You can't simply say the day the lockdown is over that we just get up, dust ourselves off, and pretend that nothing has happened. Because in fact, it's going to take a very, very long time for economies to limp back into something resembling normality. And for that, you must have very, very large public spending. You must actually prevent a complete nosedive. And so these very large packages that are being offered, as well as very, very loose monetary policy, you would have thought that monetary policy couldn't get any looser than it is. But it is getting looser. If you can imagine, there is even more liquidity being thrown at the system. And of course, very, very large fiscal deficits, which are probably going to be funded, a lot of it, through borrowing from the central bank, which is basically like, quantitative easing for the state, giving money to the state rather than to banks. Okay. Ayan is asking what kind of second order and third order effects could possibly affect the economy in this lockdown. I'm going to come to all of those, Ayan. I'm going to discuss broadly. Let me just look at the overall picture, and then we'll come down to our own economy as well. But let's look at the global and then the regional kinds of matters first. So, is the fiscal response big enough? We don't know yet. We know that it's big. We know that this is bigger, by the way, than happened during the recession, the global financial crisis, right? So yes, there is a recognition you need a really big one, but it's not coordinated. A lot depends on how it's actually distributed. How much of it is just going to be a handout to cronies, to companies and large corporates who may not actually help in reviving the economy? How much of it will keep demand afloat? How much of it will keep households surviving? How much of it will keep employment levels going? Which is why the UK strategy of providing 80% of the wages to make sure that employment losses are not so large, that's actually something useful for many developed countries if they could consider that kind of program. So at this point, we don't know if it's enough. But we do know that whatever has been done so far is going to be at the minimum absolutely necessary. It may not be enough, but we'll have to see how long it lasts and how the other repercussions play out. Now, finance, I mentioned. There's banking, there's portfolio flows, there's insurance. All of them are going to face problems, okay? I'm less concerned about portfolio flows. Equity markets were anyway already overblown. And frankly, I'm not too worried about what's going to happen to the equity markets. I am much more worried about credit, and there will have to be something done about that huge backlog of loans, much of which is going to be simply unpayable. Okay, so definitely that is an issue. I'm going to come back to what needs to be done about that in a minute. The big issue is that we know that the way COVID plays out. Now, this is the strange thing about a virus. A virus, in principle, doesn't recognize social and economic distinctions, right? It will attack anybody. It will not ask you which class you come from, how many assets you own, in India, which caste you come from, whether you're a man or a woman. It attacks you. Although I'm told it's more men are likely to be affected than women, but nonetheless. But we have managed to create societies that are so unequal that we have made the very process of catching the disease unequal, the process of being treated for that disease unequal, and the process of the impact also unequal. So even in the advanced economies, this COVID-19 is going to dramatically increase inequality. And depending on what the response is, the public response could either increase inequality or decrease it. And that's why it's very important not just to look at the absolute number, so much percent of GDP or so many billion or trillion dollars, but to actually look at how that is being spent. Okay, Radhika is asking that we should talk about the impact on women, economic and social. And I definitely will, Radhika. I'm going to come to that, especially when I'm looking at the developing countries, because I'm just trying to go down that particular thing. Alagiri Swami is asking, state government expenditure is being assigned to take care of the migrants. This is an India-specific question. I'll come back to that, Alagiri, okay? Because I'm currently looking essentially at the global economy. Okay, now let's look at what happens to developing countries. And here, if you thought this was bad news so far, wait till you hear what's happening to developing countries. So let's look at what has already happened in the first 1 month since we've really got this impact of the virus spreading globally. Only 1 month, okay? UNCTAD has done an assessment of what's happened for developing countries till the 20th of March only. And of course, since then, we've had another 10 days when things have got significantly worse. So what happened? First of all, in fact, there was a collapse in trade volumes, and in commodity prices. So overall commodity prices have fallen by 37% just in this 1 month between 20th February and 20th March, by 37%. Energy prices, oil, we know, fell by 55% in that 1 month. Minerals prices, industrial metals fell by about 18%, agriculture by 7%. No, sorry, industrial metals also fell by 55%. Livestock fell by 18%. So all of the things that a lot of developing countries export fell very, very sharply in price. And of course, the volumes also have collapsed, obviously, because a lot of freight is simply not moving. Now, that's one part, that's the trade part. But then finance has reacted even worse and more quickly, more sharply. So net financial flows to developing countries fell by 67%, no, by 60%. Now compare this to what happened just after the great financial crisis, okay? In that period, the 2 months after September, that is October and November, when it was the real impact was felt across the developing world, financial flows fell by 25% to developing countries. Now already they have fallen by 60% in that 1 month. Since then, as I said, till 20th March, since then they have fallen even more. So it's a much larger amount now that we're talking about. Portfolio flows have fallen by 70%. So stock markets, like many developed emerging market stock market values are collapsing, of course. There's a massive increase in bonds, in the yields of bonds issued by emerging markets, which again is a very, very serious problem because it makes borrowing for public debt much more expensive. And already there's a decline in remittances. No surprises, because the workers abroad, if they haven't lost their incomes, they've certainly operated on much, much lower wages. Many of them are in lockdown and therefore not receiving wages. And so remittances have already started coming down as well. I'm going to come to policies. Kedar is asking about UNCTAD's proposals, which I completely agree with, and I'm going to come back to those. And Sojanya is saying that the world economy is headed for an unprecedented recession, with the likely exception of China and possibly India. Why is this so? That recent report is by UNCTAD. China, yes. Unfortunately, I don't agree about India. I think India, we are headed for well, not just headed for a recession, we're currently in a recession, but we are going to be in depression if there are not very, very serious measures. So I don't think we can think that India is immune for this. Now, let's look at the medium term. This is what's already happened. This bad news is just till the 20th of March. And as I told you, it got worse in the last 10 days. So it's bad news already. What's likely to happen? And unfortunately, even worse is going to happen. All right. Why? Because international trade is going to take a while to recover. It's not going to, as I said, that even if we are able to beat this virus as a world together, if we can beat this virus in the next couple of months, we can't simply then get up and say, okay, fine, now we carry on where we were in November 2019. It's not going to be that way. It will actually have led to devastating economic impacts because of these negative multiplier effects. The losses of jobs, livelihood, the collapse in investment, all of these will mean lower demand, which will mean lower incomes for those who would have supplied those goods and services, which in turn means they will consume and invest less. And there's a negative spiral, you can see. They like to, in the business jargon, they call this negative feedback loop. But it's basically a negative multiplier effect that is playing out. And that is going to persist. So both volumes and prices in international trade are going to be low and stagnating, except for particular things where shortages may emerge. That doesn't include energy. So energy prices are likely to stay low. Oil prices are likely to stay low. I know there are people in India who say, well, that's a good thing. We're all right then. Because, oil prices, we are net importers of oil. We will benefit. Not so fast. It's complicated. Because you may be importing oil and getting it at a lower price, but your demand for oil has collapsed. And because you were exporting, that is, India was exporting many goods to the oil exporting countries in the Gulf and West Asia and so on, their imports will collapse. So we will be exporting less of that. In fact, the total impact on the balance of payments is not clear at all, whether we will be necessarily better off. The oil price decline will help us in terms of our oil imports. But whether that's enough to balance all of the other negative tendencies in our balance of payments, I don't think it will be enough. I think it will be a very, very small silver lining at best. Okay, then of course we have the breaking of supply chains. Now this is a very important point. People had noticed this when China was affected, that already certain commodities were becoming scarce, not necessarily because the final good was imported from China, but because essential raw materials came from China. In India, for example, 90% of our bulk drug imports come from China. And so the cessation of production in Wuhan, the difficulties of getting a whole bunch of supplies out from China impacted on our pharmaceutical supply. But this is just one. There are zillions of commodities across the world that are affected by global supply chains. So the possibilities of shortages emerging is very, very high. It's not only the final demand that matters. It's even things that you wish to import and are able to import, which will be harder to do simply because this has been such a global disruption of production. Okay, Rohan is asking, is there any way to decompose the decrease of the oil price into the effects due to the pandemic and the effect of the Saudi Arabia-Russia price war? Actually, I would say yes, because we had the effect of the Saudi Arabia-Russia price war already starting in late January. And it's true that the pandemic had already started and China's imports of oil had already come down, but the global imports had not come down in the same way. It's really from mid-February onwards that we see global imports collapsing, and that's really because of the pandemic and the curtailment of economic activity. So, in fact, I would say it's not the pandemic, it's the countermeasures, it's the policy response to pandemic, which has been lockdown, closure, this terrible word, social distancing, but basically preventing economic activity, which has impacted on oil price. Dilara is asking, now that it became too obvious whose lives and whose not, that whose lives matter and whose don't, and the divide between informal and formal economies throughout the world. Yes, I'm coming to that. I'm coming to the income inequality and massive inequality issues that emerge from this in a minute. But right now, let's just finish with the main macroeconomic implications. Dilara, I'm sorry, is also asking, do you see any potential major social and economic change for a more egalitarian society requested by people, especially for people in the informal economies, if we survive? Again, I'm going to come back to this question because it's very, very important, but let's first get a sense of how bad it is, and then we come to what we can do about it. What will be the intensity of service-oriented, Vidya is asking, what will be the intensity of service-oriented economies and states? And when will GVCs come back to momentum? It depends. It depends on how quickly we can control the virus, how quickly we can lift all of these controls on mobility and physical activity and economic transactions. At the moment, it's really not clear. Claire, what is your sense of the best economic measures that have been taken? And if you're looking from the standpoint of a woman domestic worker in Lebanon, for example, what would be the best? Again, Claire, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to the measures when we've covered how bad it is and what are the areas that we need to look at. Nagraj, the last time China's stimulus played a key role in the Chinese and world economy coming out of the 2009 crisis, how much can they do now, given China's high debt levels and low demand in export markets? Yes, I think the ability of China to lift a large part of the developing world out of a major depression is definitely less than it was in 2008-9. Okay, it's less. It's not that it's non-existent, but it would require a very, very large and determined global effort, not just Chinese effort. And I'm going to describe what kind of global effort is required. Okay, now, what else is going to happen in the medium term? I've already talked about financial outflows. We're going to see more of those. We're going to see currency depreciations, which means that you will get an inflation coming from the currency side and from the shortage side. Cost push inflation, not demand pull inflation. Okay, you will get that kind of inflation. You will get significant increases in debt servicing costs, which means developing world is going to find it much, much harder to pay its existing debts that are denominated in foreign currency. So all of that will increase. There are going to be problems in accessing bond markets, and bond prices are going to collapse. And so it will be harder. The yields will go up. It'll be harder for governments even to actually borrow in global bond markets, sovereign bond markets. And I already mentioned the problems in insurance. These are just as true for developing countries. These are as important for developing countries in terms of the need to actually underwrite a whole lot of insurance companies who would otherwise basically collapse. Now, Tyler is asking, where do you see the shift of labor, formal and informal? What will be the emerging businesses after the COVID impact is mitigated? So globally, there is clearly a shift already towards informalization, all right? Even the countries that were seeking to formalize were formalizing enterprises rather than workers. And the kinds of protection that formal workers have, less and less workers in the world have, in fact, as a proportion. The developing world has always been largely informal, and especially countries like India, 90% of our workforce has informal contracts. But increasingly, we'll find that formal workers themselves or workers in the formal sector will have less protection because employers will be less willing, given the uncertainties. You see, what COVID also does, don't forget, is that it dramatically increases risk and uncertainty for producers, for employers. And they are less willing to take on any kinds of fixed cost, including the costs of workers, which are fixed costs, wages and salaries. So they'd be less willing to take on those kinds of things unless there is concerted action in the opposite direction. Rajinder is asking, will the private sector survive this? And how, or if any, what? Yes, well, government, you can't have a government takeover of all economic activity in the world today as we know it. In fact, my fear is rather that governments will tend to try and shall we say, give more concessions to large capital, to big corporations, to help them survive, give them bailouts and so on, rather than focus on where they should be focusing. So Saujanya is asking, do you believe policy propositions such as the provision of basic income has a higher ethical purchase now more than ever? Yes, absolutely. I am not as such a big believer in basic income. I think rather employment programs are better. But right now, there's no choice. People cannot work. You have to give them basic income. You have to provide them enough to survive and live, and also that shore up demand in that manner. What is the impact of COVID on agriculture? I'm going to come to the sectoral impact in a minute. Tarun is asking, the pandemic has once again shown the resilience of the dollar as the reserve currency. What does this mean for the developing world, if anything? Yes, isn't it weird? When the US has a financial crisis, everybody, the flight to safety is to the dollar. When globally there's a pandemic that breaks all supply chains, everyone's uncertain, there's risk, the flight to safety is to the dollar. So currencies across the world are depreciating because people are uncertain and don't know what to do. And therefore, where do you keep whatever savings you have? In the safest possible place, the US dollar. Never mind if the US is actually having the most number of COVID-19 cases and is showing a very dramatic rate of increase and has a government that very openly suggests that it's not interested in the global economy, it's interested in America first. Never mind all that. Nonetheless, in periods of uncertainty, finance flocks to the seat of power. And unfortunately, that global seat of economic power is still the US. We'll come back to that and what it means for the global architecture in a minute. Rohan is asking, would governments have greater incentive to print money given the expectations of an inflationary environment? If so, is hyperinflation far more likely in the next term? So governments definitely have much more incentive to print money. In fact, they have no choice but to print money. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But is that going to be inflationary? No. The inflation is going to come from supply bottlenecks. The inflation will come from production that is not happening and shortages that emerge because of that. Where you expect printing money to be inflationary is if it's demand pull inflation. But right now, in fact, there's no demand. People have got no incomes, livelihood. The economic activity has collapsed. Printing money is simply, and providing it to government is simply to enable a stabilization of that economic activity. And that is absolutely necessary to just have economies survive this phase. Now, does that have to be inflationary? No. And by the way, over the last 10 years, we have already seen the biggest increase in money supply in the history of capitalism without getting inflation. Okay, so it doesn't follow that just increasing money supply gives you inflation. In this case, as I've said, the inflationary potential is essentially from supply bottlenecks. And so the point is that this is both a demand and a supply crisis. You have to also deal with supply, and that has many important implications. Himanshu Chauhan, do you think the US and other developed nations would collectively want to cut down on trade with China and would mostly focus on domestic production? And Shoma, what will be the impact of COVID-19 on the stock market in the long term? If people have invested in the stock market, should they withdraw from the market? Right now, the stock market is bad news, and it's going to stay bad news for a while. In the long term, well, how long is your term? In, let's say, 4 or 5 years, I believe that the power of financial lobbies is still so strong that they would ensure government policies to shore up stock markets over 4 or 5 years. But that's a political economy guess. That's not necessarily, if you like, a sort of economic law written in stone. It really depends on how governments respond. My perception of most governments in the world is that they will do whatever it takes to preserve finance, unfortunately. Okay, I just want to get on. Okay, Aarti, no, sorry. Maybe we should let you. Thank you, Tarun. Yes, I'm going to. Okay, if you don't mind, no questions for the next 5 minutes. Srishti, okay, last question from Srishti. If developing countries do not provide fiscal stimulus in the aftermath of a recession, is there any way for the economy to pick itself on its own? I'm going to say no. There is no way that economies can simply get up after this crisis is over and say, fine, crisis is done, we don't have COVID-19 anymore, so now let's just carry on business as usual. It will not happen. We would be in a downward spiral because of the negative multiplier effects. Now, I'm going to actually just try and finish what I was going to say, and then maybe we can have another set of questions right now, okay? Because otherwise, I'm going to take too long just talking. Okay, now, among the impacts on the developing countries also, which I haven't yet mentioned, is the effect on policy space. I kind of mentioned it. I told you that it was going to be harder for developing countries to access sovereign debt markets, that they're going to get less financial flows, there's going to be balance of payments problems. So there's going to be a foreign exchange constraint, which many countries haven't had for a while. Remittances come down, exports come down, and yet you need more imports of all kinds of things. So it's going to be very difficult. Fiscal problems will emerge, especially for governments that are constrained because they don't actually print currencies that everybody wants, all right? So there are implications for government budgets, and these are going to translate into significant problems in terms of the ability to spend what is required, to do whatever it takes to actually recover from the crisis. Finally, I just want to talk about the impact on inequality in developing countries. I briefly mentioned it for developed countries, but it's already come out in the questions, and all of you are aware that in the developing world, there are massive, massive distinctions, which mean that you cannot talk about one homogeneous impact on an economy, even when the macroeconomic impact is one big fat impact. We know that there are huge differences between formal and informal workers, that across sectors, agriculture, industry, services, formal services, informal services, all very differently affected. We know that manufacturing has particular requirements and has particular impacts. We know that men and women tend to have different effects in terms of their lives and livelihoods, also because women tend to be much more engaged in informal work and in unpaid work in their homes and communities. And a lot of that unpaid work is going to increase massively because public services will be affected. So there are many ways in which this crisis is not only unequal across the globe between developed and developing countries, but also very unequal within countries. All of these sectors are differentially impacted. In different countries, agriculture is in India being affected by the lockdown more than anything else right now because farmers cannot access mandis. They cannot actually sell their produce, and they cannot get the inputs required for further production and all kinds of things like that. They are forced, even with a moratorium on payments, they will still have, this is not doing away with that interest payment, which they will have to pay a few months down the line, and so on. So there are many, many different ways in which there is going to be an increase in inequality because of this COVID-19 crisis. And one of the important things to remember, if you're looking at the gender dimension, particularly, as I know Radhika had asked, is that women tend to be not only dominantly responsible for unpaid work, but hugely in the front lines of all care work. Care work is, of course, essential right now. We're in a health crisis, after all. We know that frontline health workers tend to be mostly women, but there are also women at the lowest end of the pecking order, the least protected in terms of wages, conditions of work, even protective equipment during this pandemic. Already we have had deaths of at least 5 health workers in India, 3 of whom were sanitation workers and 2 of whom were low down in the list, so they didn't get the protective uniforms, the protective gloves, the protective face masks that are assumed for doctors and more recognized health workers. So women are at the front line of care. They do this in underpaid or unpaid fashion across the developing world. They are more likely to be infected and suffer the implications of it. They are less likely to be treated in that sense. I'm told that the virus attacks men, at least so far. The little epidemiology we have suggests that it attacks men more virulently, but we don't know enough about it yet. But we do know that this gender dimension plays out in the health. We also know, and this is globally the case, there's interesting work done by Elisa Braunstein and others that shows this, that women, when there's a shortage of jobs, women get rationed out of them. So when there's a shortage of good jobs, desirable jobs, women get rationed out of those. when there's a shortage of jobs altogether, women get rationed out of those. And we have seen this play out in India. We have seen women disproportionately lose employment in India over the last decade when overall jobs were declining. So there is a massive impact on inequality. What is also worth noting is that this is not just an inequality spread because of the disease. This is an inequality created by the response. It's the nature of the response that has added to inequality. In India, the lockdown has a dramatic impact on informal workers. And by the way, that's actually true across the world. A lockdown, first of all, hits the incomes of informal workers, those whose payment depends on whether they work or not. And therefore, immediately they are the ones who are deprived of incomes for this period of the lockdown. That's a massive inequality. Those who have salaries and those who are getting who have the payroll subsidy and so on, they can still maintain some income, even if it's less than it was before. It's not zero. Whereas informal workers, through periods of lockdown, tend to have zero income. Migrant workers, again, less protection. It's not just external, global migrants, cross-border migrants, it's also internal migrants. In India, the tragic stories of all these people crowding into bus stations, railway stations, desperately trying to walk hundreds of kilometers to get home. It's not only because they want to be at home, which is a place of greater safety, but also because often their place of stay is associated with their job. Construction workers who've lost their jobs have also lost the place to stay, which was typically just sometimes a shed or a tent near the construction site. Other informal workers, often they had jobs linked to the place of stay. And when they lose those jobs or when they're told to go away and not come back till after the lockdown, they even lose their place of stay. They are rendered homeless. So we are talking about massive inequalities, which are not necessary, which need not have been as bad as they were, but have been done precisely because the lockdown has been insensitive to that kind of differential work that is done by people and the kinds of contracts that they have. We have talked about the differences across men and women. We've talked about farming and other services and so on. Now, this inequality, which is being driven by the response rather than by the disease itself, it's not, in India, we've had a particularly draconian form of it, to the point that I would say that it's not just cruel, it's actually sadistic. The way in which workers who've been rendered homeless and deprived of all their livelihood are then being beaten, harassed, sprayed with chemicals on the road as punishment, being thrown into temporary jails. This is the term that has been used by the government, and viciously attacked by police in different parts of the country, simply because they are on the roads, they have nowhere else to go, they are trying to get to their homes. And they do not trust the state because their experience of the state has been of a force that is violative of their rights rather than protective of them. So I think all of these inequalities are massive, and it requires both national and international policies to deal with them. Lots of bad news, okay? Lots of very, very bad news. I did warn you. So now the question is, how do we deal with this? What is to be done? Obviously, we need big changes. This is, as I said, it's an unprecedented crisis. So we need unprecedented responses, okay? We can't say, oh, a little bit of increase in fiscal deficit or a little bit of an increase in global liquidity. No, not good enough. This is something that has not happened in global capitalism for a century or probably ever. It has never happened before. We have to survive. We have to have a global response that has never happened before. What kind of global response? First of all, we need big changes in the global architecture, okay? The role of the International Monetary Fund is absolutely crucial at this point. Not because I'm a big fan of the fund and what it's been doing generally, but it's the only global organization right now that we have, and we don't have time. We don't have enough, months and years to go out there and say, well, okay, let's set up another organization that will be progressive and democratic and equitable. We have the IMF, we have to make it function and do what it's supposed to do. The reason for having an international organization is to deal with international problems. If not now, then when? So what should the IMF do? A massive increase in global liquidity by issuing special drawing rights. Okay, now somebody mentioned the UNCTAD report. UNCTAD has actually estimated that they will need a minimum of $2 trillion. Developing countries alone will need $2 trillion. Even the IMF, Kristina Georgieva, has just come out and said that her low down estimate, the minimal estimate, is 1.5 trillion. So let's say $2 trillion as a baseline, okay, as UNCTAD has said, and $1 trillion in debt relief. Because the other thing you have to do is cut a lot of the debt. Haircut. Just get rid of a large part of that debt. Immediate debt relief. This is not as crazy and unprecedented as it sounds. Germany in 1951 got half of its debt cancelled, and the other half reworked into really generous repayment terms where they could repay only 3% of their export earnings indefinitely. Okay, it's possible to do. And it's been done before. The countries that are opposing it today are the ones that benefited from it in the past. So we need a dramatic debt restructuring, and we need a dramatic expansion of global liquidity, of special drawing rights to be made available across countries, not just in relation to their share of IMF quota, but I would say use the Keynes formula. Give developing countries double their quota because they need more. So developing countries get double their quota, developed countries get their quota. Okay? We need a dramatic change in terms of the architecture of allowing capital controls. Some of us have signed a statement globally that has said that right now, all the IMF and World Economic Forum and other prescriptions that say you can't do capital controls should be lifted. Developing countries must be allowed to institute capital controls. Otherwise, we will be bleeding money from our portfolio accounts, from our debt. We will be bleeding money to an extent that we will really have no foreign exchange left. So you've got, right now, as I said, because it's a period of uncertainty and speculation, everybody rushes back to safety. That process of rushing back to safety will make things so much worse that more capital will then flee. So you have to stem that. So you have to allow capital controls immediately. That's the next step. 3 steps, therefore. Big increase in global liquidity through SDRs, big increase in, allowing capital controls, and enabling a debt reduction, a very, very dramatic debt reduction, debt relief. The UNCTAD has suggested around $1 trillion. It could be worked out, but that seems reasonable at the moment, immediately. Okay, now it's very, very important, of course. And then finally, this is now the time to have another global Marshall Plan. One of you had asked, can China play the role of reviving the global economy? And in fact, if you remember what happened after the Second World War, the US played that role of reviving the global economy. And one of the major steps it took was the Marshall Plan. It was much more geographically limited. It was only Western Europe, but it provided over a 4-year period 5 times the amount of capital that was with the IMF. That's the kind of money it gave in the late 1940s, well, actually in the early 1950s, to Western Europe to allow the reconstruction and revival of those economies. And that was crucial. That laid the basis for the subsequent expansion of Western Europe. Germany, France, Italy, all of the industrial miracles in these economies was enabled by this kind of massive expansion. This is the kind of thing we need to think of. We need a global plan that will actually provide resources to countries and economies that would otherwise sink. China on its own cannot do it. It has to be global. And it's in every country's interest to do it. Just like we now realize for public health purposes, it's in every country's interest to spend on public health. Because when it's a contagious disease, the health of the richest person in the country depends on the health of the poorest person as well. You cannot shield yourself beyond a point. But as I mentioned, it's very important that the measures that are taken, both internally and internationally, do not exacerbate inequality, that they don't go disproportionately to bailing out large corporations, that they don't disproportionately allow them to make hay, as finance made hay after the global financial crisis. Everybody else was paying the costs. finance had a good time. Finance continued with its activities, often in very irresponsible ways. So there are many things we could do, and I'm sure I'm going to look at the questions now. I'm sure there will be many, many suggestions and questions talking about the different things that can be done. I just want to highlight one other aspect. It's not about the economy, but I think it's a real danger that we have to be aware of and ward against. And that is the potential socio-political fallout of this. I think we all recognize this. We see it happening, and we're powerless to do anything about it. This is, in a way, a wonderful chance for authoritarian governments to reassert and centralize their powers. We are seeing it happening in many parts of the world, including in my own country. But across the world, governments are looking at this and saying, hey, I can do all kinds of things. I can, first of all, chuck out a lot of the workforce and make everybody do stuff online, let's say in universities. I can force everybody to reveal more about where they're going, what they're doing, who they're with, for public health purposes, because I have to track them in case of infection. So basically, there's a huge centralization of powers that is enabled, and also a much greater acceptance of monitoring and surveillance by governments, because everybody will see that it's necessary to control the next pandemic or something like that. There's also going to be, I suspect, an increase in censorship and control of information flows. We've already seen this in India. The government actually went to the Supreme Court asking that every news item on COVID-19 and the government's handling of it should first be vetted by the government, which basically means no accountability, right? So there will also be greater attempts at censorship and control over information. And of course, as I mentioned, COVID itself, the virus is not unequal. It's not a respecter of social and economic distinctions. But we as a society are forcing it to behave in unequal ways. And we're forcing both the impact of that virus to be unequal and the access to health that will enable your survival prospects to be unequal, and the impact of the measures to control the disease to be unequal. And then perhaps, unless we fight against it, even the stabilization measures and the recovery measures to be unequal. So that's what we have to guard against. Now, how do we guard against that? There are ways of doing it, but I think at this point, I should perhaps look at the questions and answer some of the questions that you've been putting in all this time. And I see that there are lots of these. Okay, Srishti, I answered. Rajendra Rasu, trillion-dollar stimulus packages provide government spends money into existence. Proves that governments spends money into existence. Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand that, but basically the point is this. Money is not a sort of fixed iron chest that is hanging out there and there's only a limited amount of it. Money you can make. Money exists often between human minds. We trust money because it's backed by a government. That's why everybody finally trusts the US dollar, because it's backed by the most powerful government in the world. But in fact, therefore, it means governments can create money. They can borrow from central banks. It's called a monetized deficit. They used to do it heavily in the past. It was part of Keynesian policies. It's only inflationary if you have reached your supply limits. You have some limit on supply. That's only when it's inflationary. The point is to use a significant part of that money to actually get rid of those supply bottlenecks. Because this COVID outbreak and the subsequent lockdown are definitely creating supply bottlenecks. You have to address those. Just a point I wanted to mention, and I didn't, and it has reminded me. One thing we don't realize, this is going to force governments back into planning. Because how do you get rid of a supply bottleneck? Supposing the Indian government has announced, for example, that they're going to maintain the supply of necessities, food and medicines. Okay, which food? How much of it? Where is it produced? What do they require? What are the inputs? What are the distribution channels? All of that they have to think about. Which medicines? What do they require as inputs? What are the packaging requirements? What are the distribution networks? All of that they have to figure out. You can't do that on its own. You can't simply say, I will allow food and medicines. You have to plan it. You have to coordinate it. You'd have to work, the Indian government would have to work with state governments, local governments to figure out where, what those producers need in terms of inputs, where they will be selling, what are the ways in which they would send it forward, all of that. That's planning. Governments had forgotten about planning. They have to bring it back. We are inevitably heading for much more state intervention in the economy. The point is to make sure that it's done properly. If it's done in a haphazard, random way with the use of the stick and just aggression, it will be a mess. You will get chaos. You will not get the delivery of essentials and necessities. You will get shortages and high prices of those and queues and perhaps even social unrest and riots. So to prevent that, you have to have planning. We are back in a world where planning is inevitable. Okay, Thomas is asking, COVID-19 was caused by global travel, deforestation, biodiversity losses. It unveils weaknesses of the socio-economic model which the world has adopted over the past 50 years. Yes, I would say over the past 100 years, and you're right. Definitely, it is a fallout of globalization that, it was spread so rapidly by migrants. But we have had the Spanish flu, which was a global pandemic a century ago. We've had the Great Plague, which was a slightly more long drawn out pandemic over most of Europe several centuries ago. Uh, I would argue that COVID is one of the results of the way in which we have panned out. But it's not deforestation which has caused COVID. Deforestation is giving us other problems. We haven't even talked about climate change. But all the things that I said about COVID, they're actually more important and will soon become because of climate change. The fact that you need a global response, the fact that you have to have massive increases in public spending, in global liquidity, that you have to actually have a planned response in terms of how you do the mitigation and the adaptation and all of that to the big climate changes that are already upon us, and how you do all of this by not increasing inequality. If anything, by trying to reduce the inequalities and preserving livelihoods and conditions of informal workers and unpaid workers and so on. That's really the challenge. Okay, Toma, again, is COVID-19 an opportunity to rethink development and the and re-embed the economy within the constraints of the biosphere while achieving social justice? Absolutely. This is definitely that moment. It definitely is. Well, it's many things. A lot of people have said this, right? That one of the only, possibly the only good thing is that when you go out, of course, you can't go out, but if you could go out, you would find that the air is clean. In Delhi, we have the best air quality that we've had in 20 years. A lot of people in India die of lung-related illnesses, and that's really because of atmospheric pollution. So it's going to make us rethink, I hope, as a society, many things that we just sort of took for granted, and you said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Again, you cannot change those things without a social consensus in favor of planning. Okay. Kavya is asking, due to printing currency, would there be a cost push inflation leading to a stagflation or hyperinflation? So look, a cost push inflation is because costs are going up, because typically there will be a scarcity. I am talking here about inflation driven by shortages. That's really what's going to happen. And of course, in developing countries, some of it will be shortages because inputs, like imported inputs, are going to become more expensive because of depreciation of our currencies. But it's driven mainly by shortages, which is why it is so important for public intervention to reduce those shortages. This is not just a demand crisis, it's also a supply crisis. You have to do both together. But you can't just say generalized supply increase. You have to say, you figure out which are the ones that really matter. It doesn't matter if some luxury items, perfumes, the price skyrockets. It doesn't matter. It matters crucially if basic necessity prices skyrocket. Okay. COVID has the liking, this is Rajendra. COVID has the liking for rich countries. I didn't, oh dear, have I lost that? Wait a minute. Rajendra's question has Where did it go? I'm so sorry, Rajendra, your question has disappeared. Can you type it in again, and I will look at the other questions first. Radhika. Oh, sorry, no. Saujanya, what is the viability of open market operations by central banks to stimulate demand? Monetary policy has done whatever it could. It's really done, it's been stretched to its limits over the last decade because most governments across the world have used monetary policy, not fiscal. We've got to the limits of that pretty much. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. You still need a loose monetary policy, particularly with respect to public spending. So you definitely have to make liquidity available to governments. And I would say you need other financial policies. You need a moratorium on repayments for credit and insurance and so on and so forth. You need all kinds of that kinds of financial policy. Whether open market operations in themselves will do much good, I frankly don't really think so. Radhika is asking, the experience of the IMF of developing countries has been horrifying and structural. Why will it be any different now? Yeah, that's the tragedy, Radhika. That is the tragedy. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to sit around and make another institution. We need to have action now because we are going to be in a downward spiral. In fact, we are in that downward spiral. So we have to arrest that spiral as soon as possible. So we have to bring pressure on the IMF to provide a massive increase in SDRs. I think it's encouraging that Kristalina Georgieva has actually said that we need a 1.5 trillion stimulus. I think it's encouraging. Let's hope the US does not veto it. But if they even agree to, let's say, $1 trillion increase in special drawing rights, $1 trillion increase in its own quotas or something like that, that's some move forward. I agree with you. It's going to be interesting. 85 developing countries have already approached the IMF for emergency relief. Now, it's going to be worth examining whether the IMF is going to require its usual austerity package in return for the money. And if it does, then we're doomed, okay? But let's hope there is enough global pressure and enough sense, enough brains in their heads not to demand that kind of austerity package right now. Okay. Trisha, will the release of pandemic bonds by the World Bank be of any use? When already the pandemic has spread all across the world. In retrospect, was an observation period of 12 weeks too long? This is a very tough one about what was too long and how much did we expect. And I'm not an epidemiologist or a health expert, so I don't really know what we could have anticipated and what we should have done. Certainly, the Indian government should have been much better prepared and allowed its people to be better prepared by, not just springing on them a lockdown with 4 hours notice and so on. But globally, the World Bank's bonds, they're too little. Maybe too late as well. You're suggesting they're too late. That's possible, but they're certainly too little. Given the scale of the problem, given the numbers that I've outlined to you, and which other UN agencies are saying as well, they're too little. They're not going to make much of an impact. And of course, who's going to invest in a pandemic bond today? Would you? So, really? Okay. Aarti is asking, where is it? Oh dear. Aarti is asking, do you think the pandemic could serve as a shock to the unskilled labor, the migrants, and that they might hesitate to come back to the cities for employment? I think there is a real possibility because the cruelty of the response, as I said, the pure sadism of the response, the lack of support, the lack of even consideration among employers, among neighbors, it does give you pause, right? And so certainly many would think that no matter how terrible the conditions in the villages, maybe it's at least we will have, a roof over our heads, people who we love, who care for us, and so on. I don't know. It's a hard thing to say, but also remember that Indian villages are also not just the most wonderful places on earth, not just because of the material conditions, but because they are also cesspools of inequality. Caste inequality, gender, patriarchy, you name it. Indian villages are not pleasant places for underdogs. So you might still get migrants who move only because the options are so either limited or pretty horrible. Katie is asking, what is an economic response which prioritizes workers' rights, targets inequities, and doesn't wholesale bail out an industrial architecture which isn't meeting needed targets for climate justice? Yes, exactly. So here's the thing. What do we do with all the money that I've outlined that we need right now to stabilize the economy? Okay. And I think this is where this whole issue of going back to basics is actually interesting, because governments have to be forced to go back to basics. If you want to ensure, if you are creating a lockdown, and if that lockdown persists over, let's say, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, even in that period, you'll have to ensure the supply of necessities. Somewhere people are going to have to decide these are the necessities. And so that's interesting in itself, that we will be forced to say this is what we have to produce for our population to survive minimally in a decent way with dignity. Recognizing that, and then thinking, how can you produce that, not just with preserving physical distancing, but also by with least risk. And I think this will also make societies across the world recognize that there are more things than just a health risk, a pandemic. There could also be genuine risks from climate change, which also can be global. So I think all of those realizations will mean that you will have to think of, first of all, much more state intervention in the economy. Secondly, redirection of economic activities to the basic necessities and the things that make life worth living, rather than a whole bunch of other things. The role of finance, for example, would have to be rethought so that it actually just meets the needs of the real economy, which includes providing basic insurance and so on. But perhaps that massive spiral of all kinds of sophisticated financial instruments that didn't do much except put pockets in the hands of money in the pockets of financiers, maybe we rethink all of that. So a response will have to be, number one, shoring up incomes of the poor through, at this point, through cash transfers, through basic incomes provided to everybody simply because they are not being allowed to work. Secondly, ensuring food, basic food supply of a varied diet, not just food grain, obviously, of a varied diet. Okay. Secondly, ensuring other basic necessities, proper homes that enable the kinds of physical distancing that may be required in future. Adequate access to water. In many of our slums, they're saying, how do you expect us to wash our hands with soap and water so many times when we have 2 buckets of water per household for the whole day? So access to water, access to basic amenities, access to things that enable hygiene. All of these are basic goods. We had forgotten thinking about what are basic needs. We will have to think about those. And we will have to think about how to produce those in a sustainable way. But it will force everybody, and governments, in fact, which had stopped thinking about that, to concentrate their minds on what people really need and how much of the other stuff was superfluous. Shutapa, what happens to women, gender, sexual, and caste minorities engaged in precarious work, like domestic work, sex work, various kinds of reproductive labor? Bad stuff happens. First of all, unpaid work increases. Secondly, women and all of these categories that you mentioned, all of the marginalized groups, all of the disadvantaged groups get disproportionately thrown out of employment. They get rationed out of good jobs, of decent work. Thirdly, they have less access to basic social protection and they have less assets. And that in turn tends to make them more reliant on those within the household who do. And that, of course, especially for women, opens up the road for all kinds of domestic abuse. There are already horrific stories coming out of Italy that the prolonged lockdown has led to a significant increase in domestic abuse, to the point where women, special shelters are being opened for women who are being forced to stay inside with physically abusive husbands, and they need a place to be distancing without being exposed to physical danger. I couldn't see this kind of thing happening in India very easily as well. So bad things will happen unless we are conscious of them and unless state policy is immediately directed towards alleviating those kinds of concerns. Tarun, given that we need to reimagine ways of organizing and resisting, are you worried about what political universe will emerge out of this? By having us indoors, where will resistance come from? Yeah, you said it. Bad news, right? That's what I mentioned about how this pandemic is also giving massive power to governments. It's giving them much greater control over the economy for sure, but also over every aspect of our lives. Much more knowledge about us, more monitoring and surveillance. We're stuck indoors. They know when we step out. They can come and get us. Even in my university campus, they're patrolling the streets. And if they see people standing outside, they really are vicious with them, okay, outside their own homes. So it's, yes, much, much more power to governments. And of course, they like it, right? So they're going to want to keep things this way for a while. They're going to encourage us to actually do much more of this, less meeting people. And they don't want human beings to meet. So here's the thing, we go through cycles, I guess, civilizationally as well. And we're in a bad space right now. There's no doubt about it. But, human ingenuity has always overcome oppression. It always has in history. It's bad right now. It may well get worse. And certainly this pandemic has provided many opportunities for things to get worse. Will it stay worse? Not indefinitely. And as I said, the human spirit has survived a lot worse, and it will survive this as well. And it will find ways of dealing with this. We will come out of this, and we will come out of this in the beginning, possibly as a worse society, because all the ugliness and the selfishness and the unnecessary hatreds will have been exposed. But then the futility of those, when confronted with that even bigger threat, will also eventually become apparent. And we will, in fact, then, I believe, move towards a much more egalitarian and inclusive kind of social option. Why will China not go into a recession? Because it is having much more state intervention. It's doing the kinds of things I suggested, that you have to plan on how you allow production, etc. Having said that, China is a very authoritarian society. It is almost a totalitarian state that controls every aspect of what people do. So I'm not saying that this is the kind of social outcome I would like, but I'm simply saying that as an economic outcome, they will be much more efficient in coming out of it. Karthik, the credibility of multilateral institutions and indeed economists hit an all-time low in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis, and that doesn't seem to have been reversed in the decade since then. Well, mainstream economics, I mean, to me, the very fact that mainstream economics exists is living proof of the fact that markets don't work. I mean, here is a discipline that gets it wrong all the time, continuously, and then gives the same terrible advice and gets it wrong again. And yet they survive, right? And yet governments keep listening to them and people keep believing them. So to me, that's living proof that markets don't work. This is not to say that there are no economists who are not telling it like it is. There are, and there have been, and even before the 2008 crisis, there were many progressive economists who pointed out that this was going to end in tears and spoke about how it would, and even predicted it, not the date and time, but predicted what was going to happen. There is still a very significant number of economists who are making very sensible and strong and useful statements. The point is to get the rest of society to actually listen to them. The point is also to get governments and our leaders to listen to them. Ayan, the MSME, Nikita, how can we see growth, environmental sustainability debate now? Do we actually need to decline growth in order for countries to grow more after looking at COVID cases? Do we need to decline now to grow more later? Let me put it this way. There is this big debate between degrowth and green growth. And I think it's a very bitter debate at some levels, but at one level, if you look at their proposals, the proposals are broadly similar. The proposals are basically saying rethink our consumption patterns, rethink our production patterns, rethink how we allocate investments and how we incentivize particular are necessary for dealing for the aftermath of COVID-19. Okay, Ayan, the MSME sector has been ordered by the government in the absence of GST write-offs, tax concessions, and other forms of remuneration, how can enterprises keep running viably? They can't. And in fact, it's absurd. You cannot order them unless you actually underwrite some of those costs. So it's a meaningless gesture. It's just them pretending that they've done something and showing their concern. They know it won't work. They know that in most MSs, most workers don't even have a contract. There's no question. And so if you are not actually providing an incentive to them, like saying, I will pay so much of the salary over this period, and so you have to prove that you're paying those wages in order to get that subsidy. Other than that, this is not going to work. And I believe that the government is cynical enough to know that it won't work and is doing it anyway. Vamika, will the pandemic result in an increase in the crime rate due to higher inequality? Sure. I mean, I would be very surprised if it didn't. It's not just inequality, it is desperation. We are throwing a significant part of our population to the wolves. And you cannot blame people for getting angry and then doing whatever they think they must do to survive. Yes, all kinds of social unpleasantness can come out of this. And that's why it's so important to put in place policies that would actually counter all of that massive increase in inequality. Devashish, is it important consumption and hence the GDP? Yes, absolutely. That's precisely what I'm saying. Income transfers to people, all workers. And there are, in India, you could take many lists, all of the MNREGA workers, all of the Jan Dhan accounts, all of those who access the National Food Security Act, rations. You know, there are many lists we could use to provide cash transfers to, let's say, 70, 80% of the workforce and provide enough for them to survive over the next 3 months. That would at least keep, and then ensure, spend the rest of your fiscal spending on ensuring that those supplies are met, that you are producing enough food and necessities and other commodities of widespread mass consumption. Okay. Rajinder, if our fiscal space is enormous. If it could be defined in terms of huge unemployed and infrastructure to build, because that only creates money as government spends, not the excess tax revenue. Will the government use this opportunity to provide job guarantee? Look, we already have a rural job guarantee which is unutilized, which right now you can't do it. During the outbreak, you're anyway not allowing anyone to do anything. So you cannot actually do public works programs right now. So you have to do income transfers right now. You have to just do cash transfers into people's accounts. But over time, yes, a job guarantee, both rural and urban. There are some very good proposals for urban job guarantee, which could be put into place, which would also help in greening our production and our infrastructure and our cities, which would also help in creating a resilience for future pandemics, in ensuring public health, in providing palliative care, in a whole range of things, in urban areas as well. Devashish, by loosening the monetary policy, we increase the liquidity in the economy. By reducing the rates, we expect the increase in borrowing by the public. But do you think at times like this, why would people invest? Absolutely. I mean, would you right now invest? You're going to wait. Yes. So reducing the borrowing rate is only helpful for people who have existing loans that get cheaper, like EMIs and so on. And that is helpful. Okay. But it's a very minor step. It's not enough to make a big change. You really have to do money supplied to the government and allow the government to spend more. In other words, monetized deficit is the way to go. Isn't it important to have stronger fiscal policy and increasing? Yes, that's why I just answered that. Rajinder, if world governments could spend trillions now without tax revenue, we could do so for, yes, exactly, they can. That's what I'm saying. The IMF massively increases the supply of special drawing rights, okay, which it can. So it doubles the special drawing rights that every government can access, which allows all governments to import more and to pay some of their debts, and which frees a lot of fiscal resources for governments to spend within their economies. Okay. Secondly, every government borrows from their central bank. Monetized deficit. Easy. No problem there, okay? Will it be inflationary? Only if there are supply bottlenecks. So use some of that money to address the supply bottlenecks. That's the point, okay? And by the way, there will be supply bottlenecks anyway, because you have a closure, you have a complete lockdown and a cessation of economic activity. So whether you like it or not, there are going to be supply bottlenecks. Sumita, how long will it take for India's economy to be back on its feet? And which sectors, industries will be affected the most? And which ones will get a push? Darling, I'm afraid it will take a long time. As I said, there are so many imponderables. We don't know. We don't know how long the thing will last. We don't know how bad, we don't know how long the lockdown will last even. And we don't know how badly or well the government will handle it. So far, I have to say they have not handled it well. They have mismanaged it. So it depends on many things. The best case scenario will be a recession for this year, and a significant loss in employment and a significant attack on livelihoods. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is beyond contemplation. And I don't want to destroy the rest of your evening by talking about that. Do you anticipate, says Srijana, Sanjana, sorry, do you anticipate that the increasing government control will disproportionately affect religious minorities? What safeguards should civil society and the public push for to protect against this hazard? Yes, isn't it dreadful? In India, for example, even in the COVID-19 disaster, we are managing to find Hindu, Muslim. I mean, it tells you how much poison has been injected into our society in the last 6 years, or maybe in the last several decades. Unfortunately, we have become a crazy society in India. I would say it's a lobotomized society. We've lost our brains with our crudest and vilest instincts for many things. And that in turn means, and government seems to enjoy that. It seems to enjoy creating divisions that allow it to kind of, emphasize its concern for majoritarianism. I don't know how much that can survive in the face of such a generalized crisis, because this is a government that has shown that it is not just aggressive and terrorizing of minorities, but it's also heartless and cruel to the Hindu poor, to the majoritarian poor, and the informal workers and the migrants and so on. So, I don't know how long you can just keep feeding this whole religious sentiment thing and succeed in suppressing all other kinds of concerns. Okay, oh dear, many more questions. Sharanya, is there a merit in the argument calling for nationalization of hospitals? Absolutely. I mean, it's depending on how many cases we get, I think we would have to do it at some point. So Spain has already done it. A number of other countries already have very extensive public health systems. So if we get a very large spread of those who are affected, I think we would have to do it. Smriti, I know the issue of migrant workers wanting to return to their hometown. How should it have been handled? Facilitating their travel may not have been correct, as they may have become carriers of infection while traveling. Wait a minute, you can do this for migrants who happen to be in Italy or in China. You can send special planes to bring them. You can charter planes to bring back 100 migrants in different foreign countries, from Paris, from London, from Italy, from China. You can't do it for your own migrant workers who are in their own country, in their own homeland. You cannot provide them. You cannot, first of all, give them, let's say, 3 days in which to actually do that. You cannot put in place emergency trains, cancel all other trains, put in place only emergency trains, ensure physical distancing on those trains, provide district administrations with enough facilities to do quarantine when they arrive at their destination, the same way you have done for our privileged elites who were brought back. Even last week, there was a special chartered flight of children of the rich who came back from Europe. That is allowed. It's only the poor who have to be beaten and injected and threatened with all kinds of prison and other kinds of things, and even sprayed with harmful chemicals when they are trying to get home. It's not just unacceptable, it's also stupid, because in that process, you're adding to the infections. Okay. Oh dear, listen, lots of questions. I don't know how long you go on till. Will the organizers let me know how long we can go on. I would say another 10 minutes. So I'm just going to look at all the questions and then answer as many as I can. Is that all right? Okay, Tarun. One silver lining of the online session is that it's made it accessible to people far away like me. Thank you, Tarun. Okay. Amarjit, do you think the West will never recover from Corona? I wish. Look, unfortunately, global power imbalances will remain. China will definitely become more powerful than it is now, and the US will decline. But overall, will global power imbalances remain? Yes, they will, unfortunately. And in fact, in the immediate term, as I mentioned, because developing countries are going to be worst hit, they could actually even get worse. Okay. So is this the end of Western civilization and now all of us in Asia can? No, I don't think that's the case, right? It's a more complex process. The decline of the US was anyway going to be underway with Trump and all the crazy policies and so on. And the rise of China relatively. But does that mean global power imbalances end? No. Tyler, we're seeing a consolidation of political power, as in Hungary. Yes, exactly. Terrifying. And many people in India fear that something similar could happen here, that you would declare an emergency, for example. Okay. Will we also see consolidation of market power worldwide or in certain parts of the world? Okay, so political power, yes, you're absolutely right. There is, as I mentioned, a centralization and greater control of states across the world. And in some cases, very open and blatant, like in Hungary, and I suspect soon in India. Market power is a different thing. Market power is the power of large corporations, particularly. And that really depends on the political economy of the outcome and how much the outcome is shaped by states who still need legitimacy, and whether they can deliver the legitimacy through just control or they will actually need to provide something to people. So it's not very clear right now whether market power of corporations, which by the way was at its peak, it was more than it's ever been, that market power, will it be more after COVID-19? I'm not sure. Will it be the same? It may not be. There may be controls. It depends, really. As I said, the political economy is something that is not written in stone. It can change. Okay. Hitul is asking, distress among agrarian economy and steps for combating it in India. The rural economy needed a package a long time ago. The rural economy was already in distress, and there are many measures that have been put forward which deal with the entire spectrum of agriculture. So in agriculture, you need a six-fold thing. You need to deal with credit, with the whole issue of financing the working capital and investing for productivity increase. You need to deal with and the bad loans that many farmers are holding. You need to deal with irrigation and water access and the unsustainable use of water and the equitable provision of water. You need to deal with other inputs, which are very, very commercialized and currently create all kinds of other hazards for farmers, including excessive use of pesticides and control by large corporations of seeds and so on. You need to deal with outputs. And how you market it and how much you can post-harvest crop and how you can deal with all of that. You need to deal with post-harvest produce and processing. And you need to do it with on-farm other activities like livestock and dairy and so on. That's just agriculture. Agriculture accounts for less than 40% of rural income today. So you have to think of non-agriculture. You need to inject demand into rural economies. And for that, I have argued a very good way of injecting demand is massively increasing public services. In India, we hugely underprovide public services to our population, especially in rural areas, both health and education, but also sanitation, security, therapy, all kinds of care services, a wide range of other services. We need to provide public employment, good quality, proper public employment that provides all of these services. That has huge multiplier effects. That generates a whole bunch of other employment and activity. And so you will get a buoyant rural economy. Okay. Oh dear, in the meantime, I got zillions of other questions. Madhav, what industries can be leveraged by the government and private sector to restart the economy, as we know, after the world has recovered. As I said, you have to begin with the provision of basic goods, basic necessities. And of course, that definition itself, we have to think about what are basic. What are the things that everybody must have to live a life of dignity? And how do we ensure their production? What are the input and output relationships that we have to bear in mind? Can we just say food? Do we need to think about all the inputs that go into the processing and the packaging? Do we need to also think about all the things farmers need and the agricultural equipment they need and the fertilizer and pesticide and etc.? So I'm saying it's a complex thing and it needs to be thought of in a planned manner with input-output relationships recognized. There's no evidence that the government is doing this so far, but if you don't do this, then you're heading for a right royal mess. Okay, Radhika, if staunchly neoliberal countries such as the USA are spending 10% of GDP, why is the Indian government so tight-fisted? What a good question, Radhika. I wish I knew. You know, it's as if they haven't realized the magnitude of the problem. They're just doing business as usual. Maybe that's all they know. The same pretend thing, you know, so they present what they claim is 1.7 lakh crore, what is it, 17 trillion rupees, whereas at least 50 trillion of, at least 1/3 of that, 40% of that is already existing schemes. It's window dressing. Why would you do that at a time like this? Are you not interested in reviving the economy? I mean, I am at my wits' end to understand what they are thinking. I wish I knew why. But it seems to be that they think they can skate along by just, you know, feeding people all the things about how whatever the great leader does is all right. And therefore, you know, if you die of COVID, that's because COVID is a global pandemic. But if you survive, it's because your great leader has saved you. I don't know. I don't know why they're being so tight-fisted at a time like this, but I haven't understood why over the last 2 years they haven't done anything to revive the economy. Ayan, could you save this video to your channel? Yes, I will definitely do that, Ayan. Rajinder, I think that's the last question. All governments are, oh, it's not, wait a minute, are caught napping with respect to lack of critical and strategic infrastructure. Post-COVID, that could be a top priority and should be a top priority, isn't it? Particularly when we could face climate catastrophe. Yes, absolutely. And you see, just like people had warned about pandemics, by the way, even 4 or 5 years ago, there was talk about pandemics and their implications, and nobody took notice. People have been warning about climate catastrophe, and they're not taking notice. Maybe now they will. Will free universal health and education be more likely, or deepening privatization of these? You know, I think we would go more for public health across the world only because they now realize it also affects them and it affects economies and it affects profits. That's the bottom line, right? In other words, I think finally they've realized that public health matters. It's not only about privatizing everything, even though right now Indian government is still privatizing tests and, you know, not making tests free and so on. But I think over time that realization will sink in, that you ignore public health at your own peril. Okay, these are the last 2 questions. The first by Debin is COVID-19 or any other such virus that has global impact manifestation of the existing neoliberal economy or the cause for an alternative economy? Let me put it this way. The pandemic itself is not the result of neoliberalism. The responses also are not fully neoliberal, okay? But the way the pandemic is playing out is massively worsened by neoliberalism. It's much worse than it could have been because neoliberalism has already meant a decline in the number of beds per person, even in the richest countries. It's already meant a decline in basic public health measures, even in the richest countries. And of course, a non-existence in the poorer countries. So austerity measures, neoliberalism, privatization, all of these have made the pandemic much worse than it need have been. And I think the way out of it, obviously, is to therefore shed that whole way of looking at economies and of looking at how we organize our economies and societies. Paras, Paras. The government yesterday has announced that it is front-loading 60% of the borrowing for the first half of 2020. Shouldn't they have just increased their borrowing considering this massive shock? Yeah, I think, they're still, as I said, they haven't realized the extent of the problem, and they're still enthralled to what they perceive as finance. So they're going to, this is another way of, they're going to end up with a larger deficit anyway. So maybe this is just, as usual, a window dressing. It's pretending that we're only front loading, whereas actually they're going to end up with much more borrowing. And if they increase borrowing, should it be tapping cheap foreign funds be a good long-term option, considering we have refrained from this for a long time? No. Right now, it's going to be harder and harder to access. I just told you, bond yields are going to be rising now, and it's going to be much harder to access. So right now, helicopter money from your own central bank, that's the way to go. Many state governments are going to face severe pressure on their finance. How are they to address salary? Is salary cut an option? I think salary cut is a disaster. It's macroeconomically stupid. Telangana, it's been ridiculous what it has just done, the Telangana state government. The central government really needs to massively increase its spending and allow state governments much greater fiscal leeway. It must transfer more of the monetary resources, the helicopter money that it's getting from the central bank. It must transfer these to state governments. Okay, I think I should stop here, and thank you all for staying with me this long. I think that's it. Okay, goodbye, everyone.